Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into a book today that's really going to make us think differently about things. It's called Boasting in Weakness by Rick Thomas.
Interesting title, right?
It really is, and I have a feeling some of you might be thinking boasting about weakness. Is that allowed? But trust me, this is not your typical self-help book.
Not at all.
This deep dive is for everyone, no matter where you are in your faith journey.
What I find so fascinating about this book is that Thomas tackles a subject a lot of people, maybe even most people, try to avoid,
Mm.
and that's weakness. He really challenges us to rethink what it even means to be strong, especially as Christians.
Yeah, he goes right to the heart of it, right? Like those moments when we feel weak or like we're failing, those aren't detours on our spiritual journey. He's saying they're actually essential.
He actually calls them tools that God uses to mold us and refine our faith, which is a pretty radical thought when you really think about it.
It is. And to illustrate this point, he uses this really powerful image of jars of clay. Like we're not these invincible, flawless beings, we're more like those beautifully crafted clay pots.
Yeah, those ones that are beautiful, but you can still see the cracks, the little repairs maybe.
Wear and tear of life, right?
Exactly. And that's where Thomas says God's power really shines through in those cracks, those places where we're most human, most vulnerable. He often chooses, as Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, the foolish and weak things to confound the wise.
It's kind of like the Apostle Paul himself comes to mind.
Yeah.
He experienced some incredible hardships, imprisonment, persecution, all of that. But even in the midst of that, he acknowledged his own weaknesses. He didn't shy away from them.
Absolutely. In 2 Corinthians, you can really hear that tension in Paul's voice.
Mm.
He's longing for relief from these trials, these hardships. But at the same time, he recognizes that God's power is at work through those very trials.
So maybe it's less about praying for God to just take away our problems and more about shifting our perspective and asking God, even though this is hard, how can I rely on you more in the middle of it?
That's a huge shift in perspective, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that leads us to what I think is the core of Thomas's message, this whole idea of boasting in weakness. Now, this isn't about going around and bragging about our flaws or failures, just to get attention.
Right. Imagine someone boasting about getting a C on an exam or like, hey, check out this new cavity. Doesn't really make sense, does it? Especially in a world where everyone's obsessed with looking perfect all the time.
Totally. And that's where Thomas says we've got it all wrong. He challenges us to redefine strength. True strength, he says, isn't about denying our limitations, but actually acknowledging them and then allowing God's power to work through them.
He uses public experience in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 as a perfect example of this. Paul actually says he'll boast about his weaknesses so that Christ's power can be seen even more clearly.
Yeah, that's pretty radical when you think about it, like flipping the script completely.
And the best part is, Thomas doesn't just leave this as some kind of abstract concept, right? He illustrates it with this really compelling story about a young woman named Bifina. She's brilliant, crazy smart, but instead of being this gift, her intelligence becomes this source of pride, and it ends up isolating her from others.
That story really got to me because it shows how any strength, any gift, when we don't keep it in check and we're pursuing it for our own glory, it can turn into an idol. In Bafina's case, her intelligence, which is amazing, becomes this way to earn love and validation instead of something to be used for God's glory. And that's heartbreaking, but also, I think, really relatable.
It really is. It makes you stop and think, what are those idols in my own life? Those things I pour all my energy into, hoping they'll finally bring me that fulfillment I'm longing for, but they never quite do.
Yeah, that's a question we all need to sit with for a while.
Yeah.
Because I think when we place our identity and worth in those things that the world tells us are important, we're always going to end up disappointed. Always.
It's like we build our whole identity on this idea that we got to have it all together, that's the only way we'll be accepted or loved. But then Thomas throws this whole other idea at us, lowering the standard. What do you think he means by that?
Well, it's kind of like a subtle trap we can fall into, even when we're trying to do the right thing. We start twisting God's standards, making exceptions here and there just to fit into our own little comfort zones. We create our own definition of what it means to be good or righteous.
It's like those times when we tell ourselves, it's not a big deal, everyone does it, like those little white lies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thomas actually uses this story of a guy named Biff to show how this plays out in real life. Biff is so obsessed with looking perfect, with everyone thinking he's got it all together, that he starts justifying these little lies to maintain that image.
And it's fascinating because in Biff's mind, he's being righteous. He's not relying on God's grace, but on his own ability to keep up this facade. But of course, we all know what happens with those little lies.
They snowball into something much bigger, messier.
And in Biff's case, it ends up destroying his marriage.
Wow. So it's like a wake-up call, right? True righteousness isn't something we can just manufacture ourselves no matter how hard we try. It's not about following some rule book perfectly.
Exactly. It comes from Christ alone. It's a gift, pure grace, not something we could ever earn.
So it's not about striving for a flawless life, but about surrendering to the one who already is flawless and accepting his grace, even when we mess up, which is, let's face it, pretty often.
All the time, right?
Yeah.
And that leads to this other big idea Thomas talks about, which is embracing the imperfect. And I think this one really hits home for a lot of us. Think about the pressure we face constantly to measure up to these impossible standards.
Oh, tell me about it. For women, it's this whole beauty standard, always be younger, thinner, smoother.
Yeah.
You know the drill.
And for men, it's all about that drive for success, more money, more power, more recognition. It's exhausting. And it leaves us feeling like we're never enough.
Totally. So if God's not calling us to be perfect in that way, what is he calling us to do? How do we even begin to embrace our imperfections when we're constantly being told we need to change?
That's where Thomas gets into this idea of dying to self, which I know sounds a little intense, maybe even a little scary.
Just a tad.
But really, it's about recognizing that true life, true freedom, comes from surrendering our desires, our need to control everything, to God.
It's about those moments when we finally say, okay, God, I can't do this on my own. Your will be done, not mine. It reminds me of what Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians, how he felt burdened beyond his strength, but then found strength in God.
Exactly. And that often means God will allow us to face situations that are honestly beyond our ability to handle. Thomas tells this really powerful, really heartbreaking story of a single mom named Mabel. She's doing everything she can, working, raising her kids, trying to keep a roof over their heads, but you can just tell she's at her breaking point.
She's trying to do it all on her own, and it's just too much.
And that's the point. God sometimes allows us to face those impossible situations, not to punish us, but to teach us to depend on him fully. It's about drawing us closer to him.
Yeah, we've all had those moments, haven't we? Those times when we faced something that felt completely insurmountable and we had no choice but to let go of our need to control everything and trust God.
And it's in those moments, those terrifying, uncomfortable moments, that we often experience the most growth. And that leads us to this idea of stepping outside of our comfort zones, which, let's face it, we humans tend to like a little too much.
So it's like we crave that feeling of security, you know? Knowing what to expect, not rocking the boat too much. It's comfortable. But are we sacrificing growth for that comfort?
That's exactly what Thomas is saying. He even connects it back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Remember, they chose to grasp at godhood, wanting to be in control, even if it meant disobeying God. What happened? Fear, shame, hiding.
They traded true freedom, real intimacy with God for this illusion of control. And don't we do the same thing sometimes, clinging to the familiar even when deep down we know it's not what's best for us? It's like we're stuck in that little box on the comfort zone diagram, afraid to even peek outside.
But think about it. It's usually in those moments when we do step outside that box, when we face our fears and embrace the unknown, that our faith really takes those big leaps forward.
It's that whole leap of faith thing, right? Knowing that even if we stumble, God's right there to catch us.
Absolutely. But here's the thing. Even when we get that, even as Christians, it's so easy to slip right back into that self-reliance mode. Like we forget who's really in control.
It's like we think, okay, I got to figure this out. I got to have all the answers, got to fix it all myself. Like we put all this pressure on ourselves.
Thomas calls it functional atheism. We're going through the motions of faith, but deep down, we're relying more on ourselves than on God.
It's sneaky how that happens, isn't it? And it can affect every area of our lives if we let it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
When we need a reminder of what it looks like to depend on God completely, we don't have to look any further than Jesus.
Because even though he was God, he chose to humble himself, to empty himself, and rely fully on the Father.
Yeah. Philippians 2 says it so well. It says, Jesus did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant.
Yeah.
Humility, dependence, even when he was facing the cross.
Powerful stuff. So how can we start recognizing those self-reliance patterns in our own lives, you know? Those moments when we're clinging to control instead of letting go and letting God work.
Well, Thomas talks about creating what he calls a self-reliance mind map. Basically, it helps us pinpoint those areas where we tend to default to our own strength instead of God's.
Okay, I love that. He actually gives us practical tools like that to use in our everyday lives. This isn't about just being passive or giving up on our responsibilities, right?
Not at all. It's about recognizing that true strength, true fulfillment that comes from surrender. Surrendering our need to be in control and instead allowing God to work through us, even our weaknesses.
It's about embracing the freedom that comes with letting go of our plans and saying yes to his plan, even when it means stepping outside our comfort zones, facing those unknowns.
And that brings us to what I think is a really beautiful part of the book, what Thomas calls the gospel solution.
Okay, I'm listening. What is it?
It's remembering that this isn't about us somehow achieving this perfect self-denial or finally becoming this flawless person. It's about constantly coming back to the truth of the gospel.
Coming back to grace.
Yes, grace upon grace upon grace. It's admitting that we can't earn God's favor. We simply receive it as a free gift through faith. Like it says in Ephesians 2, for by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast.
We're saved by grace, we live by grace, and when that truth really sinks in, it changes how we see everything.
Absolutely. We're free from that burden of always striving, that pressure to perform. We can finally rest in God's love for us, knowing that our identity, our worth, comes from Him, only Him.
And with that freedom, with that security, it's like we can face our weaknesses, our imperfections with a new kind of courage. Because we know God's grace is always enough. His power shows up strongest when we're at our weakest.
That's it. And I love how Thomas wraps up the book. He reminds us that as we're learning to embrace our imperfections and depend on God's strength, something amazing happens. We start to discover that real joy, true fulfillment, doesn't come from what we achieve, but from surrendering to the one who already loves us completely, flaws and all.
Wow. So much to think about, right? To everyone listening, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, keep seeking truth.